think I'm having a heat stroke.
Apple people are going to hate me. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Tom Nardi.
This is episode 267. This week we'll be talking open source software, decoupling caps, DIY VR, Hackaday stuff. This week in the news, we got some super big open source news. Last week or the week before, we covered controversy about Red Hat possibly trying to restrict the further distribution of the source code to its operating system. So they'll sell you a Red Hat license, they'll give you the source code, and then tell you that if you were to redistribute it to other people, they'll close up your Red Hat license, which is kind of effectively violating the GPL in that, it has it's at least effectively violating the spirit of the GPL, not a lawyer, because they have this freedom to redistribute clause. Right. And this is trying to get around that.
Yeah, I don't see any way this is not a violation of that. Although you'd have to assume that they wouldn't have done it unless they thought they had some kind of legal ground to stand on.
What their lawyers are thinking is that there is no way for you to enforce having to be able to buy a future version of Red Hat software with them. There's nothing forcing them, the company, into continuing to sell to you. And so they're just we don't want to sell to you anymore for unspecified reasons. We don't like the way you were looking. We don't like the way you were looking at us.
And I suppose the argument is that the GPL doesn't say they have to give you future versions.
Yeah.
Because you would still have the source from the version you purchased, technically.
Yep. And you can, exactly. But it's definitely strong-arming you into not redistributing the source code.
Yeah.
And that's the part that doesn't work out very well with the open source software community. And so what happened is that the news this week then is that SUSE Linux, which is a very open source, actually also very popular in the business community, Linux distribution, said, okay, well, we'll fork Red Hat and we'll supply it to you. And in fact, we'll put up $10 million to back up the effort.
And then in the comments too, somebody said that Oracle is also not doing a fork or anything, but they've released a statement that was surprisingly sassy for a company post. It was very, this is wrong and here is why. And they even had this, kind of Socratic method thing where they're like, oh, is that right? No, it's not right. It was very interesting to read. You could tell somebody was super, super mad.
Yeah, and the Oracle one kind of rubs me a little bit the wrong way. SUSE is a really good open source player and has been very serious about upholding open source ideals, as has Red Hat in the past. So, on the other hand, Oracle is the backstory is, of course, that IBM bought Red Hat, and Oracle gets to dunk on IBM. That just doesn't sit quite as well with me.
Yeah, it's definitely dirty, and it's only just begun.
Yeah, exactly.
There's still plenty more, I attempted to go on Stallman's site to see if he was ranting about this, but all I could find is the other 10,000 things he hates.
Right.
He has an alphabetized list of things he hates, and this wasn't on there yet. I imagine it'll come soon. He has a page on Wendy's though. He doesn't go to Wendy's. Doesn't like Wendy's. Doesn't like Airbnb. Doesn't like Grubhub. Doesn't like anything almost.
Closed source hamburgers, man. I can't get behind that. I can't get. What's the recipe for the spicy chicken? If you don't tell me, I'm not going to eat it.
I was curious about Wendy's, right? Because I get the other ones almost. So I had to look at Wendy's, and that one was because some treatment they did towards workers or something. It was it was more in his political thing than tech. But I was curious, what could they be doing? What kind of violation could Wendy's be doing that McDonald's is innocent of?
All right, well, let's head on to What's That Sound?
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
This week is a Guess the Sound week, which means I'm going to play a sound. Tom Nardi's going to take a stab at it.
Yeah.
And then we'll turn it out to you. So have a good listen here.
What the?
I'll give you a hint. It's a musical instrument.
Oh, okay. I mean,
I just need the name of the musical instrument.
I don't.
So easy. So easy.
Yeah, right. It's weird. My first instinct was it sounded like some Wild West kind of thing, you know?
Right.
But then the more I listened to it, almost more like an Asian sort of thing, like a kung fu movie. But the name of the instrument, I know. Is it a string instrument?
No.
No, so I can't even, because there's like, no, I don't know.
Very good. Okay, listeners, now it is your turn. If you know what this, granted, fairly crazy musical instrument is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast and put in your best guess. Next week, we'll draw from the right answers and someone will get a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. All right, well, let's head off to the hacks. This week, I wanted to start off with a super technical one, Proper Decoupling Capacitors by Stephen Fleemans. This one I'm picking mostly because it got written up and caused a hubbub in the comments. So first, what's going on here? The original article is about what decoupling capacitors to use on your circuit board. So the idea of a decoupling capacitor is that it kind of provides a little bit of extra power or a little bit of extra voltage protection for switching digital chips to prevent them from pulling too hard from your main power line and interacting with other chips. So you put a little decoupling capacitor near it. The trick is capacitors at low frequencies, they're an open circuit, and at high frequencies, they're a short circuit, but they're not perfect devices, and so they have some parasitic inductance and parasitic resistance. And it's that inductance that's the problem, because an inductor is a short circuit at low frequencies, it's just a wire, but if you think of a coil and try to pass higher and higher frequencies through it, less and less goes through. So it gets more and more resistive as the frequency increases. And so you have these kind of two fighting effects. The capacitor drops off its resistance as the frequency increases, and the inductor gains in resistance as the frequency increases. So depending on what the switching frequency is and what particular power supply problems you're trying to fix, you have to carefully pick where the capacitance roll-off ends and the inductive roll-up starts. So that's the basic theory here. So far, so good. And that's what's in the post. I have to take a drink. I got too excited.
Oh, yeah, capacitors will do that to you.
Dude, the high frequency effects of capacitors? Man, I got to take a break here. Anyway, so people come into the comments and are like, no, this is craziness. One of the main objections to the OP's article here is that in the old days, there used to be a standard trick, which was to pick a couple different, maybe 3 different capacitors, because they would have kind of different capacitance/inductance resonant frequencies. And so you'd pick 3 of them and it would kind of spread the resonant frequency out, and you'd hope to catch the frequency bands that you're interested in that way. And this raised the hackles of a number of people in the comments, and I think quite rightly. Hans and MS Boss and Nunn all come on strongly on this one and bring up an article by Eric Bogatin, which is particularly good, called The Myth of 3 Capacitor Values, where he kind of says this old practice of just putting 3 capacitors separated by a power of 10 from each other on the board is outdated. And the reason for that is nowadays we use surface-mounted multi-layer ceramic capacitors that basically have inductance properties that are independent of the value of the capacitance. And so they don't have this old frequency dependence that, for instance, you used to have when you had, a big old chonkin electrolytic and then one of those little flat, funny-looking ceramic ones that looks like a disc. And, you had all these different form factors that necessarily had different inductances to them because they had different wire lengths running through them. Nowadays, we don't suffer that. Nowadays, we have MLCC caps, and they basically all have the same inductance. It's just the capacitance value that's different. And so this means you have to kind of rethink this old procedure. And that's true too. And so I don't think the OP's post here is actually like wrong, but it does raise the hackles of people who are kind of used to this old, just throw a 1 microfarad, a 0.1 and a, 0.001 on there and hope for the best. These days, I don't even know. I guess the real engineer out there would say you should probably try it with a whole bunch of them and engineer it for the exact specifications of your power requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And I just throw on a 0.1 and call it a day.
Well, I'm definitely in the camp that Al Williams starts this one off saying, like, we just like to scatter them around the PCB and hope for the best. That's definitely
everybody should get at least one.
That's
right?
definitely my where I'm at, right? Just throw more at it; it'll be fine. It's interesting that like people in the comments are like, no, just go on YouTube and find this dude because he he knows way more about capacitors. But I suppose that's just like you said, the nature of things changing over time and what used to be gold-plated advice. We did the article a while back on like the right angle traces on PCBs, for like the longest time. And even now you'll see people say that, and when you look into it, it's like, well, that's not a huge problem with modern production techniques. But it's something that just keeps getting passed down because at one point it was like that was a big thing to watch out for. So
exactly,
it's interesting to see how improved technology changes some of these rules of thumb. Once something's in your head, you've been doing it for decades, and it's hard to break those habits.
Stick the capacitor triple on there. Yeah, the article's also talking about, all other sources of parasitic inductance. And that's kind of the modern take on this too, is that the MLCC capacitors have so little inductance on their own that it's really the rest of your layout that's going to be the inductive part. And so you actually just have to concentrate on how close to the power supply pins you put the capacitor and what the return path is and all of this stuff. That's where the actual stray inductance is that you want to be minimizing these days. And so, watch out for inductance in your layout is in the OP's article. And so, kind of right. Like it's not like it's half baked or anything.
Right.
But I agree that. But, I do also agree with a lot of the commenters who are like, this isn't so much of a concern anymore.
Well, my first pick this week is another software maelstrom in development. Although this is sort of an ongoing thing, right? This isn't news in that a lot of these companies are now trying to move over to a subscription model where, instead of just buying the software once, you buy it every month. The question in this week, though, is Adobe. They're going to move towards this rental model for Photoshop and all their other tools. Stuart Semple, who is an artist, and we've written about him previously with different kind of activism over like the blackest of blacks and that sort of thing. His answer to this was to start a Kickstarter for a software suite he's calling Abode, which is cute, but yeah, that would be the traditional model. You buy it once and you get lifetime updates and all that kind of thing. While we're recording this right now, it's raised over $200,000 for, what is really just a concept because there's nothing to show here. It even says the little screenshots are like, these are just illustration purposes only. There is no, and this is weird because I kind of thought Kickstarter got away from this where you could just kickstart ideas. I thought you had to have something to show, but who knows? It is literally just an idea of starting this, for lack of a better word, knockoff Adobe collection. And even they can't, to give them credit, can't put names, right? Like, so Photopop will be the photo editing one. Nice. And On Design will be the publishing application. So they got names. They got little logos. So I shouldn't say there's nothing, right? If you want to pledge, $70 for that, that's on you. Long story short, it is obviously getting some support here from a few thousand people, and they're going to try to push ahead with this. And this got a lot of comments, a lot of views, a lot of people talking about it. I think a lot of people are upset about the way that software is being treated anymore. personally, I find pretty much all proprietary software to be an insult and try to avoid it like the plague. So this is not something I run into myself. But, my first thought with this, was, if you're going to raise $200,000 from people who are frustrated with the way commercial software is being treated, like maybe you could, I don't know, give that money to GIMP or Inkscape or somebody and try to improve the state of the art of the open source options that are already out there. But if you actually read this, their goal is to start from scratch with a whole new suite of tools. And that is ambitious, to say the least. When you go into the FAQ for the Kickstarter, it only gets worse. Because somebody says, what will this work on, PC or Mac? And he's like, they talk about all different ones. And he goes, Linux, I hear you. We will scope it out. If it's not really hard, we will try our best. Which is...
Oh, dear.
But he spelled Linux, Linix, which is not giving me a lot of faith there. And then what kind of really troubled me was, is it going to be open source? Is one of the questions. And the answer is no. I won't keep you waiting in suspense.
No.
The answer is no. But then what is there in the answer is just this. I mean, there's words and they're separated into sentences and paragraphs, but beyond that, it doesn't seem to have a lot of meaning. I think like there was just, one part I liked was, he goes, to me, free software doesn't mean no money. It means freedom, as in it's yours and you can do what you want with it, which is okay, cool. That's right. That's very Stallman, free as in speech, free as in beer thing. But then it says, but to answer the question, it will be a paid program with as much of the open source ethos intact as we can possibly balance while keeping the quality we need. Like, what does that mean?
Does that mean?
You're keeping the open source ethos, but right off the bat saying it's not going to be open source. So, like, what is that? If you take the source away from open source, I'm not sure what remains.
Right.
So I'm very concerned about this. I just imagine the time it would take to create. It's not even saying, like, hey, I'm going to make a Photoshop clone, which in itself would be a huge undertaking. I mean, they're talking about the whole suite. Again, he's an artist, and I don't mean to. It's a worthy goal, right? I don't mean to talk down on what he's trying to do, right? But I do think that this is maybe more theater than a practical plan, I mean, and then if you go all the way to the bottom, it says, like, where they have the risks and challenges. One of it says, this is for real, I've found an amazingly passionate team of geeks that'll do the software development. Like, that one sentence is the extent of, like, the technical information on the Kickstarter page. Like, don't worry, guys, I got some geeks. And they told me they could definitely make a Photoshop clone, for $200,000. I mean, I'll tell them that too, but
I could do it.
It doesn't mean you're ever going to get anything. You might get GIMP with a new skin on it. And
I was going to say, hand you the GIMP source and call it a day. We're done.
We couldn't do that? Like, you didn't say
I got that. I could do that.
Like I said, maybe it's the open source zealot in me talking, but I really think, like, if you were going to get this energy and money, you would have been better off just putting it towards the open source community and bolstering those projects, because at least you'd have something to show for it, right? I mean, from day one, you could say, here it is. Even if you said, I'm going to fork GIMP and I'm going to make a more modern UI, which I'm pretty sure exists anyway, right? Even if you're going to do that, I can kind of say, okay, at least you're starting from something. You're not starting from zero. But this seems, I don't know. Very ambitious is the word. That's the nice word, right?
That's correct. I think it's way over ambitious, and I'm hoping. I was actually sad when you said that there was a team of geeks working on it, because I was hoping it was just going to be art, and this was just going to be like, see how many people are so frustrated with this licensing model that they're willing to throw money at something else, right? We'll see. Anyway, this is a funny project anyway. On the other hand, there's open source tools for all this already. And you said this. Oh, yeah. There's GIMP already if you need something for Photoshop. There's Inkscape if you need something for Illustrator. If you use Lightroom, there's one called Darktable. Is that the one? That's pretty good. Does raw film processing and stuff. I mean, there's open source alternatives for a lot of the stuff, and granted, they're not as polished as some of the industrial programs, although, frankly, I really like Inkscape. I'll put that up against Illustrator. I mean, I think the proof's in the pudding here, right? Like, with the exception of Joe Kim's art, every image you see that we've worked on, modeled on, has been done using free tools. Like,
oh yeah,
I do a lot with Image Magic on the command line, but then everything else is in GIMP, or when we have to do layout things, it's Inkscape. I mean, we've produced a website that gets millions and millions of views for 20 years using only free software. It's not like it can't be done, people. Good Lord. But we're a bunch of nerds.
We're the geeks mentioned in this Kickstarter page. But I think that's an excellent point. I've often thought of that, and I don't know how much of the audience cares, but I don't know how much of them realize that, yeah, I think with very few exceptions, we use open source top to bottom, like in the back end of Hackaday. I think not all the writers, but most of them are on Linux, and even if they're on Windows, they're using open source tools certainly for images and text editing. And I think you'd find there's very little proprietary behind the scenes. Even going into running on WordPress and stuff. So I mean,
video editing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. All the videos are done in open source tools. Yeah. I think yeah, I mean, hell, I've used OpenSCAD to make illustrations. I'll do it in 3D and then
take a picture of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there was even one where there was this cool STL viewer I found that did really nice drop shadows and stuff. This was going back to the article's years old. I can find it and link it. I made the thing. I was trying to explain how a scramjet works or something. So I did it in OpenSCAD and then loaded the STL in this STL viewer and then took a screenshot of that. And it looks really cool. It looks very professional, like this 3D render with all this shadows and stuff. But it was just me banging pans together behind the scenes.
All right, my next hack is from Dragon Skyrunner. Behold a DIY VR headset its creator will never build again. I know the feeling anyway when you have struggled through a project and you're like, okay, that's it. I'm done. Never again. But we'll see. This is the quest to make the perfect and slightly idiosyncratic VR headset that Dragon Skyrunner had always wanted. It's a super well-documented trip into doing it. What surprised me about this is that you can kind of take a bunch of parts and make yourself a working VR headset. And this is no joke. This thing has really decent resolution. It's got Vive Lighthouse tracking. I mean, he buys a module and, there's some USB hubs up there and everything gets plugged together. But you can do this. It's got fantastic lenses. It's actually got one really clever gimmick. The center of the vision where it counts are, of course, high-quality optical lenses and these high-res screens, but then out into the periphery where you don't have that much resolution in your eyes anyway, there are kind of wide-angle Fresnel lenses that also point at a lower resolution screen, so you get kind of more light and more data in your peripheral vision, even if it isn't as high quality as the stuff in the middle. But of course, you don't need as high quality as the stuff in the middle. So I think that's super duper clever. And in fact, we saw just the same week another hack enhance VR immersion by shoehorning an Ambilight into a headset, which uses something similar, except it's just, colored LEDs in your peripheral vision, like the Philips Ambilight did with TV sets. This Hades wide body takes it a step further and actually gives you some resolution there, even though it's not particularly high quality. The other thing that's really cool about the build in particular is that instead of doing eye tracking by using a camera that's way off axis, he wants to use a mirror and do a kind of an angled mirror so that you can look down with the IR camera and then bounce off of that into your eyes. And so you need kind of a half mirrored, or ideally less, maybe an only IR reflective mirror, so you can see the visual, so you could see the regular light through it, and the IR camera that's tracking your pupils can see your pupils. And he finds that specific IR mirrors are very expensive, and he uses instead an IR blocking filter for a camera, which are dirt cheap to get, UV and IR cut filters, but it doesn't cut the light. It actually just bounces it back off away from your camera's lens. And so he finds that these make transparent filters for visible light, but then it bounces IR. So Boy, there's just a lot of build detail here about all the parts of it. If you've ever wondered what goes into a VR headset, here are all the parts. Ends up being, reasonably expensive. Somebody asks how much it costs and he guesses $700. Says, will you build me one? And that's where he's like, I'm never building one of these again. This was built to scratch a particular itch and be his daily driver. And as long as he can have it doing those things and continue to do those things, he's like, I'm done. This is my VR headset.
It's very impressive. And I read the thing, and I guess I don't know enough about like the state of VR to know where this necessarily diverges. It kind of starts with this thing like nothing on the market has everything I'm looking for, and I don't know what stuff on the market has, right? Like I've totally kind of checked out from like the state. I know like Valve has a thing, and there's like the HTC Vive, but like it's kind of a continuation of my avoiding proprietary software that sort of extends into games. So I know very little about modern computer games, although if you want to talk about like Doom mods and stuff, I do. I do follow the open source Doom mods. The one thing that kind of stands out for me though, and I suppose that's one of the things he was trying to avoid, is there does seem to be like this walled garden kind of thing happening where you need every headset needs its own software and it needs to talk to the thing on the computer, blah blah blah. He does talk about that's something he wanted to get away from, that like didn't need any special software for it, or also talks about any kind of like proprietary connectors, which maybe is a thing on some of these headsets, because he says makes a big point of saying like everything is standard. It's USB, it's HDMI, it's DisplayPort. There's no weird cable that you're not going to be able to get, down the line or whatever. So, I mean, I do appreciate that this is the kind of thing you can just plug into whatever you have, and it's not, only going to work for these 5 games that were released 10 years ago, or wherever, how some of these things go. All right, so this next one I picked, it is kind of timely for me. I guess last week or the week before, I did a review for one of these, thermal cameras that you plug into your phone and view through the app. And it worked really well, and I like the hardware, but I sort of didn't like needing a proprietary app for it, and the app was a little in the first place. And, one of the things I noticed during the review is that, if you plugged it into the computer, and of course it's the USB-C version, if you have the iPhone version, good luck. But, if you plug the USB-C version into the computer, it showed up as a camera, and it was something I mentioned in the review. I was like, hey, there's probably more to this if you want to look into it. And sure enough, there is now this budding community of developers working on open source tools that support this new generation of phone-based thermal cameras that are, if not identical, all pretty similar. There's a lot of like crossover from one brand to the other, which is something I think we've all kind of noticed with a lot of this cheap imported hardware. There's a lot of crossover here. But the 2 major projects we're talking about here, and credit where credit due, Les Wright, the developer of Pi Thermal Camera, is the one who actually sent this in and kind of brought it to our attention. His is based on another project, which is the P2 Pro Viewer, which is developed by Leo DJ, and that is for another camera, but like I said, it's close enough that it all sort of worked in the end, right? And they all kind of boil down to something that, like I said, I noticed in the review, is that when you plug it in, it shows up as a webcam, but it shows 2 video feeds next to each other, which I thought was kind of weird. And that was the extent of my investigation. I was like, oh, that's weird, and I moved on. But if you spend a little more time looking at it, you'd find that the one feed is a black and white video, and that one is using like the relative temperature of the things in the frame as a luminance value, so brighter, hotter. And the second feed is this green tinted kind of Predator version that it turns out is actually the raw sensor data but encoded into a video. Each pixel, and you look at the value of it, and there's they figured out the math to get back the actual temperature of that pixel. And if you put the 2 of them on top of each other, and they eventually found an FFmpeg one-liner that would do this for you, you put the 2 videos on top of each other, you get the final thermal image in the kind of the color scheme that we're used to seeing. And then that was the basis for all these other projects that take that core idea of combining these 2 video feeds and then start layering in all the other features, being able to change the color scheme and being able to actually show on the video the hot spots and read out numerically what the temperatures are. And so this is sort of like the early days of this. It's still not going to help you on the mobile side if you need to go mobile with this thing, and there's, of course, a case to be made of being able to carry around this thermal camera if you're doing something in the field, if you're a professional and not just a nerd playing with the thing. I'm sure, crawling through a duct or something with this thing on your phone is super handy. In the course of looking into this, I found somebody on YouTube who had hooked up the camera to a Raspberry Pi Zero and then mounted it to their quadcopter, and then streamed that video to their device. So they actually had, a flying thermal cam, which is pretty cool. You could have figured out some way to do that if you were stuck using it with the phone, but it would have been more of a hassle and heavier, which obviously is not great for if you're flying with it. So there's all kinds of options out there that are unlocked by this, and I'm really excited to see what the next generation of this low cost thermal camera is going to bring us.
Yeah, no, having the ability to get the data stream out of it turns it into a legitimate lab tool. You can actually start to do real work with this.
Right.
You could point it in a particular area and write a program that says extract this temperature, and you could watch, over time a temperature in one place, or watch how it evolves from one to the other. I mean, there's all sorts of real, kind of science that you can't do with these things by just looking at pictures on a screen, right? It's nice to have the data, and so I think that's super awesome about this. My pet peeve with a lot of these cameras is that they're all auto-ranging, and so they make it look like there's this extreme temperature difference, whether there is or there isn't. And so if you watch in this video, in any of the videos, when people are using it, you put it on you move it over a circuit board and there's a white spot and you're like, wow, that's really hot. And then when you look, the dark spot is 32 degrees and the white spot's 35 degrees. And you're like, right. Oh, it was only 3 degrees. And you're really sad about it. And then you pan it somewhere else and, there's something that's 80 degrees and it just looks white, right? And so you lose a lot of things like that. And I would think it would be really helpful to put a range lock on these things, and you can do that. It's as easy as coding it up in Python. I think it's an awesome ability to have it be open source, because then people can do with it what they need if their needs aren't exactly the mainstream need that's already catered to. And I think that's... And of course, how long is it going to be before somebody writes an open source Android app for this thing? Right?
Yeah,
there's going to be better mobile phone based applications for it soon, because it's just so easy to do.
Now that the info is out there and you can see the process, and it's only a matter of time before somebody says, you know what, I'll just write my own Android app and puts it on F-Droid or something.
Well, my last hack this week comes from Jamie Matthews, and it's an entry in the Hackaday prize. Supercapacitors let solar speaker work in darkness. And I love this one because it's just such a nice project and nicely done. I always joke about supercapacitors and Peltier coolers being one of the major sources of hacker tears. And in this case, Jamie has actually managed to conquer the supercap. And that makes me very happy. What we're looking at here is a speaker and amplifier combination that's got a solar panel and 2 large supercaps inside. And so it runs essentially forever off of solar power. And what's really neat is he's picked a clever amp chip that has an internal boost regulator, and so it works with a wide range of voltages anyway. Because the problem with supercaps is, well, they're like capacitors. The voltage drops kind of rapidly at the beginning and then slowly at the end as they discharge. And so all your circuitry that wants to work with them has to tolerate this kind of really non-constant voltage, not battery-like behavior. And so here, Jamie's picked an amp chip that it's a class D, so it's a switching amp, so it's very efficient, so it can run easily off of not much power, and B, it can tolerate the supercap's kind of idiosyncratic voltage droop. And he says that he gets 6 hours of runtime off this amp when it's just playing by itself. When you add in the solar panel on top of it, it can run essentially forever, and he has run it he built this 9 months ago and has been using it every day to listen to music. So it's battle tested at this point. The other thing that's super cool about this design is the 3D printed case and stuff. In particular, it's got an off-the-shelf speaker element But then it also has a printed TPU, which is a kind of a rubbery like 3D printer filament. It's got a TPU passive radiator on the back. This is kind of a flexible membrane you put on the backside of a speaker box to change the speaker box's resonant properties and make it work like it's a bigger box, in terms of interior volume for a resonant cavity than it actually is. And so he's printed his own TPU resonator here, which is really cool. And then he's tuned it by screwing little M4 screws into the square infill pattern that his 3D print has. So it's like custom tuned for this speaker, and I just think that's lovely too. It's a sweet little build all across, and it's got some real use on it, and this is the sort of thing that everybody should have in their shop if their shop has a good window.
The thing that I took away the most of it, I don't know that you mentioned it, is it's freaking gorgeous. Like, it really is.
Oh yeah, there's that too, right?
It is insanely good looking. I mean, I was just staring at it for like the longest time, and it's like I said, it is a 3D printed enclosure, but like the finish work, it's like wet sanded and painted. I mean, this is the kind of thing no one would think is 3D printed, which is kind of like the goal, right? If you're trying to like finish a 3D print, you want to get to the point where they won't believe it's 3D printed, like they think it was traditionally made or something. I mean, it does not. There's not a layer line on this thing. It's immaculately done, and then the little logo in the script that is printed, and man, it looks so cool. The most impressive things to me, though, is that the solar panel is behind the speaker grill material, right? So, like, you don't actually see a solar panel. Like, for the longest time, I was looking at this thing, and I was like, what do you mean it's solar powered? Like, there is no solar panel. There's no obvious solar panel anywhere on it. It's actually behind the speaker grill. Presumably, there's, some loss involved in there, but, like, wow, it really... I'd say it's worth it for how good it looks. Like, you would never imagine this thing was solar powered.
While I was looking this up, I was like checking out Jamie's YouTube channel, and he's done a lot of experimenting with 3D printed speakers and audio stuff. So if you're at all interested in kind of the background and development of this passive radiator, you should check out his YouTube channel. Just a sweet hack. And yeah, haven't seen the judging for the Green Hacks round of the Hackaday prize yet, but I wish it well.
All right, and my last one here, this one's called Using an Old Satellite to See the Earth in a New Light. On the surface, no pun intended, being a satellite, on the surface, intercepting transmissions from satellites is maybe a little, dare I say, old hat at this point. We have the RTL, SDR, and other low-cost software-defined radios, and you got, plenty of information out there how to build the antennas, and there's open-source software to decode the signals, and it's not the graybeard wizardry that you might think anymore to pick up a weather satellite and grab an image. So you might think, okay, this is more of the same, whatever, this is no big deal. But the trick here is that this is a satellite that uses the video is in S-band in the 2.2 gigahertz, which puts you outside of RTL SDR, and you need to get something a little higher up the food chain and use low noise amplifiers and that kind of stuff, and a bigger dish. I mean, this is like the next level up difficulty wise, right, compared to what we've seen before. So it's worth talking about for that one. Dan Maloney wrote this one up, and I think he didn't just bury the lead. He didn't even, I think he put it out to pasture and shot it, because the satellite in question is actually a military satellite that is no longer being actively used. It was launched in 2003 and developed jointly by the Navy and Air Force research laboratories, and it has an instrument on there called WindSat, which was to figure out where surface winds were and that sort of thing. And it was like actively used. I did a little research before we went on here, and as late as 2020, it seems like it was still actively being used by the military. And it's one of these things where, like, they designed it for 3 years, It had a 3-year lifespan, so officially 2006 would have been the end of the mission, but it kept on working, so they said, okay, well, keep using it. And by 2020, I guess they just said, okay, well, there's far more advanced stuff out there. So they just kind of let it do its thing. So, I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but listening in on military satellites seems a risky thing to do, but I suppose as long as you're only receiving and not trying to transmit anything up to it, you'll be all right. And then I kind of pulled up some of the info on this thing, and in the video, Derek SGC he kind of comments that the images he's pulling down aren't great compared to what you might be used to on like a weather satellite, and he explains part of that is because like the imager is like spinning, and so there's this weird kind of distortion of the images, and that it's the higher frequency, so he thinks he's getting interference from Wi-Fi and cell phones and that kind of stuff. So there's reasons why he thinks it doesn't look that great, although it still looks better than any image I ever pulled from a satellite. I was kind of surprised because for a military satellite, you think, well, it's kind of underwhelming capability, and it turns out that like the S-band is really just for its telemetry and health info. So I think what he's pulling down here is just like the camera feed that says, hey, the camera's working, right? And then because the stuff I was able to see says like the instruments actually are on X-band. So I think that if you could listen in on that, you might actually see the real data that this is just the hello world feed from the satellite. So I think that's kind of explains why it's a little bit of a wonky image and doesn't inspire a lot of excitement. Although he does mention that it still is a microwave image, so like it goes right through the cloud layer. So that is kind of cool, where you're able to see all the continents and stuff on there without being obscured by clouds. So that there is that, but if you look at the article, you'll see that it's not the kind of thing you'll be navigating by. It's this weird skewed image that needs to be pieced back together, and there's chunks missing and that sort of thing. But what is there is pretty sharp.
And you do have to say that listening into an old Naval Research Lab satellite is pretty rad one way or the other.
Oh, it's pretty rad. Maybe not something I would do, or at least not tell the internet I was doing it. But but yeah, it is very cool. It's very cool that we're at that point.
If they didn't want you to hear, they wouldn't broadcast. My first quick hack this week comes from Brett. This is Clock Escapement uses rolling balls, and this is the strangest timer clock I've ever seen, but a really sweet 3D printed implementation. It's based on a model from JBV Creative of the Congreve rolling ball clock. And if you've never heard of this thing, it has a tilting plate with a kind of a zigzaggy pattern on it, and a ball bearing rolls from one side to the other, and then hits a lever that makes the plate flip so that it rolls back down the other way. A horrible way of keeping time. It's noisy. I've got a link for you to a museum that has one in its collection and says it's an absolutely miserable clock to maintain and keep time. But it's the cool design. And in a newsier quick hack, the demo scene, now an irreplaceable piece of cultural heritage, marks the Netherlands' elevating demo scene to a piece of cultural heritage. A lot of demo scene people have been pushing for kind of official recognition of their culture, and this builds on success that hackers have had in Finland, Germany, and Poland. And I think they're trying to get a UNESCO World Cultural Heritage designation for the global demo scene, and I think that is just fantastic. Wish you the best of luck. And bringing up the rear, Improvis thermochromic treatment keeps solderless breadboards smokeless. And if you've ever had parts get hot on a breadboard and melt the plastic, which I have, this is the solution to that. It's basically painting your breadboard with thermochromic paint. And so it's got a light pink hue to it, and where it goes white, that part is too hot. Turn the power off right now, and maybe you won't melt the thing. Sweet, sweet little hack. Very simple idea. It's old. This is an older hack, but it's one I've never seen before.
Dude needs thermal cameras, right? All right, for my first quick hack, I have Show 'em What You're Made Of with this repair logo. I really like this one. We're all familiar with the the little recycling symbol that you'll see on plastic, which I know is, technically says what kind of plastic it is, and not that it can be that was something that came up in the comments that it's not technically a recycling logo. We know but you know what it means. When you say it, you get the idea. This is a riff on that, where it's a very similar logo that indicates that the object was made to be repaired, right? Like, what a cool idea. So that you can actually, throw this on your designs, put it on your PCBs, and the fact that it's interlocked kind of wrenches only sort of made us choose this one, right? It's the sort of thing that I don't think we'll probably see adopted commercially or at the level of, the recycling icons, but I think it really could pick up steam with, open hardware and that sort of thing, and I like that there's like such a simple imagery that you can put on there, but it says so much of what the goals are and kind of where your head is at during the design. And I know I'll be trying to implement it into stuff I make. I'll leave it at that. You do whatever you want to do, but I know I'm into it, and I'm going to start trying to fight the good fight. Next up, CPM porting in a few hours. This one's written up by Al Williams. It's a video by Poking Technology, and it is, as the title says, it is a 2.5-ish hour-long video about porting CPM to a new board. And I think you'll know right off the bat whether or not that's something you'd be interested in. If you are curious about how this early operating system was moved to a new piece of hardware, this is a pretty cool rundown. Al liked it, and Al would know. He seems pretty happy with what was covered in the video. This might be a bit long. You know, we do get the occasional complaints about, you know, hey, maybe instead of a 2-hour video, you could write something down with words. But, you know, sometimes it's nice to see stuff done in real time and be able to kind of rewind and go back to see everything. And at the very least, you could probably put this on as some kind of like retro computing ASMR video as you just listen to somebody port an operating system to a weird piece of hardware. Last up, Suck aims to replace Slack in 5 lines of bash, and yes, the acronym is Suck for Simple Unix Chat. And this is kind of a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing. I don't think anyone is seriously saying this simple bash script would replace the likes of Slack and that sort of thing. But it is an interesting statement about, you know, how bloated modern software is, and we ran a story recently about how incredibly powerful modern computers are, but then the millions and millions of lines of code that seem to be dragging them down. So this is sort of along those lines where it's saying, hey, you know, Slack and its friends are great and very impressive, but if you really just want the core functionality, you could get a bash script and a few of the common Unix tools and do, you know, 80% of what Slack is doing right with the tools they're built into the operating system. I would be extremely surprised if this takes off outside of, you know, the people listening to this podcast right now. But it is really cool, and it is, like I said, it's a really cool example of just what you can do with the tools you already have. It's pretty wild how much functionality is built into the modern Unixy operating system if you are willing to dig into it and see how it all works.
All right, that brings us to our Can't Miss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. And this week I wanted to feature the start of a new series, Arya Voronova's DisplayPort, a better video interface. And over the next 3-4 weeks, she's going to be taking us deep into DisplayPort, which is kind of a lot like HDMI. But over the course of this article, she's making the case that it's HDMI but better. And actually, some of my laptops have DisplayPort on it, and I can personally attest to one of the ways in which DisplayPort is better than HDMI, which is that getting a DisplayPort to anything, adapter and or cable, is cheap and easy, whereas trying to do it the other way is nearly impossible. So if your laptop has DisplayPort on it, you win. That's a $3 cable to connect it to DVI, to connect it to HDMI, to connect it to anything. Whereas it's $1 million proposition to try to go from HDMI back to digital video. The main point that kind of underlies this article is that although HDMI is on most of our consumer electronic video gear, like, you know, TVs and video players and stuff, DisplayPort is under the hood in everything else. And particularly, it's kind of the modern replacement for LVDS in laptops and talking from the laptop motherboard to their screen. All the Apple stuff uses it, underlying its Thunderbolt peripherals. It's also a fairly reasonable protocol. It's got 4 twisted pairs and another one for the data channel. DisplayPort is a packet system, and so HDMI is actually kind of, she says here, HDMI is more like VGA than either of them are like DisplayPort. And what she means is that both of them are just synchronized streams of data, whereas DisplayPort is actually kind of like IP. It's packetized. And so the data doesn't have to be, always flowing in such a stream to be interpreted on the other end. And I guess the last thing is that HDMI is super hard to work with. And if you've ever tried to get the HDMI spec, you have to pay $1 million in licensing for it. And all of the open source projects that have used kind of HDMI-like ports kind of have to say they're something else, like digital video, or risk being sued by the HDMI Alliance, which is fairly litigious. They make their money by getting royalties from every chip that uses HDMI. And so, they're fairly sensitive to you saying you implement HDMI when you implement something that works well with HDMI. Not so with DisplayPort. So that is fantastic. It's not open source or anything, but you can get the specs easily enough. And I think over the next few Hackaday articles, Arya is going to be showing you how to work with it one way or the other. So specs in your hand or not, you'll probably be able to follow along.
I'll admit before this, I was sort of in that ignorant camp where I was like, yeah, DisplayPort is that thing that's like HDMI. Like yeah. that was the extent of what I knew. Like, yeah, it's like HDMI. It's like a little different shape. Big deal. I'll just get a cable to adapt it. I think I reviewed one of the Jetson boards, and I kind of said in the thing like, oh, it's got DisplayPort, and somebody in the comments was like, you fool, DisplayPort is the the superior thing. I'm like, whatever, But in reading this, I have to admit it does definitely seem like the better choice, and I never gave it so much thought, frankly, that how much went into it and how different it actually is. I think I may have even at some level thought it was just some kind of a modification of HDMI, but it is functionally, like you said, a totally different thing. It'd be awesome if it was open source, but I mean, that might be asking for a little bit too much. Certainly the, getting away from the fact that HDMI is backed by, media interests is helpful at the very least. At the very least, I think we all know at least that much about HDMI, because that was kind of a thing when it started really rolling out. People were complaining like, oh, if you want to record, stuff from HDMI, it was tricky, and they, you had to get the thing like stripped out the protections or whatever, and it wasn't just like the old school where you could put a device between your display and your source. Everything became really complicated, right? And like that was kind of a complaint early on. Those kind of growing pains went away, so then we just sort of became accustomed to it and didn't think about the things that we couldn't do, right? Once they've taken it away from you forget,
right?
you forget that you ever had it, right? So it is interesting to think that again, while not open, at least DisplayPort is a little bit more hacker friendly. I mean, I remember even for like the SuperCon badge, FPGA one, right? We couldn't say it was an HDMI port. We had to be
That's
like,
right.
I think it even says on the PCB
video interface,
right? It says like this is not an HDMI port, like because you can have the connector and you can even make it work at least sometimes with HDMI devices, but to actually say it's HDMI is a big problem. So it's kind of impressive that there'll be even deeper dives in this already quite deep dive. But
that's just the opening shot.
Yeah, right. I'm looking forward to it, and I think it's really cool. It talks a little bit about like the side channel stuff you can do, and
she's got a whole post on that coming up.
Because I think we've covered in the past, people using like the I2C side channel for HDMI, which is cool because we're all familiar with that. But she mentions a little bit that the side channel on DisplayPort is way more powerful and you can do a lot more stuff. So hey, maybe posts like this can kind of get the word out and get more hackers playing with this kind of thing, and maybe this will be the year of DisplayPort hacking.
Yoo-hoo!
My pick for this week's Can't Miss article is from Al Williams. It's a Retro Tectacular. The nuclear cruise ship of the future earns glowing reviews. And this is about the NS for nuclear ship Savannah, which I had not heard of before this. I was familiar with Eisenhower's, after the war, they said, hey, well, we made this nuclear bomb, and what else are we going to do with it other than blowing people up, right? So there was this push from above to, like, let's find peaceful uses for nuclear technology, and that led to the whole atom age thing, where, like, for a while in the 50s and 60s, everything was nuclear powered, right? Like, nuclear was gonna, your TV was gonna have a nuclear reactor in it, and you're gonna drive a nuclear car, and power would be so cheap we wouldn't have to meter it. And obviously it didn't exactly come true. But one of these projects was the Savannah, and it was an attempt to prove that civilian nuclear vessels were viable. There are a handful of civilian nuclear vessels. I think they're largely like Arctic icebreakers and stuff, but very, very few. Your average cargo ship or cruise liner is still burning the same nasty fuel oil it was, 60 years ago. So this was an attempt to say, hey, we could make small, reliable reactors, and we could put them in the ships, and okay, sure, they'll be a little bit more expensive, but hey, you don't have to refuel except for every decade or whatever, and you can go, hundreds of thousands of maintenance-free miles and all that kind of stuff. What I think was interesting was, like, somebody in the Eisenhower White House was like, well, we should have nuclear cruise ships, and somebody else was like, we should have nuclear cargo ships, and they're like, well, we can only build one. So let's build both, because it's not a very good cruise ship, and it's not a very good cargo ship. It's really, like, right down the middle. Like, it can do both, but neither very well. But for a proof of concept, it was worth a shot. I actually read the first time I read the article. Right in the front, Al says the ship can carry 60 passengers, and I was like, he screwed up. I gotta fix that. Can't
add
be
that
60
extra zero, right?
Yeah, right. I for sure he left a zero off. There's no way they made a cruise ship that can carry 60 passengers. But yeah, it only had like 100 rooms, and the restaurant can only hold like 75 people or something. Like, it was literally made for less than 100 passengers. This was just the level 1 proof of concept for a cruise ship. But hey, the 60 passengers had some really cool amenities, and it was very futuristic, and it had an early water-cooled microwave in the galley for cooking the food. So imagine you go on pay all that money to go on a cruise ship and they microwave your dinner. But again, at the time, this was all very futuristic, and everybody was going to be eating their dinners out of microwaves in the future. But no, it's a really cool article. Look at this. That's like I said, a story that I don't know, it's super well known. One of the details I liked is that, early on they said, hey, well, we got nuclear reactors for submarines. We'll just put that in a cruise ship, boom, and be done. At the time, the administration, the Eisenhower administration was like, nah, we don't want it to be like a military thing. We don't want people to think this is like a military spinoff. Like, you really got to do like a clean sheet civilian reactor, so that's what they did. They contracted out a marine reactor that would still be, strong enough and robust enough, to survive on a ship, but it didn't have any kind of common DNA with the military stuff that had come before, which I think was a good move. I think that was, probably the right decision. Obviously, it didn't help in the end because civilian reactors, still are not in ships, but like, it was a good idea. And I don't know, maybe the military reactors, they probably have something similar, but there was like one-way valves on the containment vessel that would open once like the pressure outside got high enough. And the idea was that if the ship had sunk to a depth of like beyond 100 feet, that would let the water rush into the containment vessel and just quench the reaction, So like, you didn't have to worry about the ship sinking and reactor going critical because the pumps stopped working, because it was going to let the seawater flood in, and you'd have to deal with the realities of a reactor that now is open to seawater. But I guess that was still seen as the lesser of two evils, right? Like, it was better than exploding. Like, let the seawater rush in, and we'll figure out how to deal with that later. It didn't do super well as a cruise ship because, again, 60 people. I mean, how long could you run that practically? So eventually they switched it over to being pure cargo, but it wasn't a very good cargo ship either. There's some interesting details, like one of the cargo bays is under the swimming pool. So, whereas usually they open like the tops, and like a crane would drop cargo into it, you had to go through like hatches on the side, which made it a huge hassle to get anything into that cargo bay. Yeah, not ideal. And it ran till like the 70s, early 70s, and then got deactivated. They took the reactor out of it. That went to go sit in the desert somewhere and cool off. The ship itself, though, is now in Baltimore, I think, which is pretty cool. I had no idea that it's just chilling, and apparently has been redone, and you can do tours of it and stuff. So, yeah, very cool little piece of that Atom Age mentality. Didn't quite work out, but hey, there's probably some lessons learned here that might be used on future ships, and especially as we're moving to electric and stuff, and getting away from fuel oil. So the ships of the future may have more in common with this than we realize.
I don't know how to make this more visible, so I'm just going to say it as loud as I can. The NPR article that has photos of a tour of this ship is just so fantastic. Al linked it. It's under the first video, and you could totally miss it. Go click that link. They are the most like 1950s photos you've ever seen in your life. They have a bar by the pool, and the wine rack for that takes inspiration from a table of the trilinear chart of the nuclides. It's got light fixtures that look like, electron orbits around the central nucleus, the kind of nuclear thing. It's got these fantastic 24-hour clocks, because that was going to be the future. These photos are just so beautiful and so like 1950s, down to the design of the reactor control room and everything. Really, really, really amazing photos. Makes me want to go tour the thing, but actually just seeing them probably does most of the job for you. So go check that link out when you get back to a computer.
I'm actually reading the NPR thing. It's kind of unclear. Can you just go and take a tour of it, or is it only because NPR wanted to take a tour?
I don't know.
Because at the end of the article, they're saying they don't know if the ship is going to get scrapped or whatever. The only reason it hasn't been scrapped is because it's technically still hot. Right. It'll be a couple more years before the radiation is low enough that it's no longer regulated, and then they can do whatever they want with it. And it sounds worryingly like whatever they want is turned into steel pellets.
The ultimate fate of the ship is uncertain.
Yeah, that sucks. It's in incredible shape for just chilling at a port somewhere.
Yeah, it's a museum piece.
Right, I assume this was a museum ship because it looks phenomenal. The little eating areas and stuff looks like you could have a meal tonight.
All right, that wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you want to follow along with the links, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And if you see anything cool or do anything cool, write us an email, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep on hacking. For clapping.
Yeah, exactly. Am I an idiot?
Naturally.
Why did I want to cover this one?
Oh boy.
I'm done. I don't like this one. I take it back. Moving on.
Now how do you think you say this name? I forgot to say his name.
I love that their security layer is we'll just use SSH.
Well, my pick for a cat miss.
What do I say next? Nah, we're just done. That was perfect. We're done.
Look at it. Oh, that's so creepy.